these things, of course, you've been taught by Ritik, I've been told. So there will be a bit of overlapping and repetition. I hope you would excuse us for that. Um, so I would like to very briefly talk about the way Rossetti has been deeply influenced and inspired by the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Then we are going to talk about the contemporary society and the suffragette movement that was taking place in the contemporary society when Rossetti was writing. We are also going to talk about the Industrial Revolution and the effect it had on Rossetti's writings before we move on to the duality that we see in her writing and the way she, despite not supporting suffragette movement directly, not supporting women's autonomy in her famous and extremely popular disavowal to sign the petition for the suffragette movement. Despite all of that, how uh, her work reflects an extremely complex mosaic of issues that were plaguing the contemporary society. But before we proceed, I would like to ask Ritik or anybody else could answer. So I have switched on my video. Does it affect the, I don't know, like, am I being grainy or is the screen being frozen? Ritik? Or anyone else could tell me? Is this
No, it's
okay?
all right.
No,
It's all right.
right.
Ma'am,
Is
you
it
look
okay?
fine.
Okay, okay,
Ma'am, you
okay.
look fine.
Okay, because once I also have a presentation, so once I start presenting, what I'm going to do is I'll probably switch off my video. Um, okay, fine then. Thank you. Just give me a moment. I'll share my screen. Okay, so our topic today is the gender and class boundaries in Rossetti's Goblin Market. The first thing that I would like to talk about is the Pre-Raphaelites and Christina Rossetti. The Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who was one of the founder members, also the brother of Christina Georgina Rossetti, they had, established the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood basically to turn to the paintings of painters like Blake, Turner, Constable, who they thought were vastly ignored. And Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Holman Hunt, John Everett Millais, they, as a revolt against the 18th century academicism prevailing in the official artistic quarters, established the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and it opposed the Royal Academy's promotion of the Renaissance master Raphael as well as Michelangelo. So they were inspired by the theories of John Ruskin, who urged artists to go to nature. So these people who established Pre-Raphaelite brotherhoods, they were both realists as well as medievalists. So they believed in an art of serious subjects, which they thought were supposed to be treated with maximum realism. Their principal themes were initially religious, but they also used different subjects from literature, poetry, particularly those dealing with love and death. So influenced by her brother's leadership, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, Christina Rossetti's poetry adheres to the ideals of the movement. While abundantly rich in detail, her poetry strives for clarity in meaning through its relatively simple rhyme schemes and language. So this is basically, the first slide would help us locate her work and place her, and help us talk about the influences that she's had, or the way she was being influenced by the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Now, what were the qualities in their poetry? One of the thing was the presence of the symbolic and sacramental meaning. The way they handled with detail, with meticulous precision. The way they turned to nature as an inspiration. We are going to talk about these categories with a little bit of detail, if I may be allowed to do so. So first, let's talk about the symbolic and sacramental meaning. Um, so the biblical references, this is something that you know, I'm sure you've been taught that this has a direct biblical allusion to the fall of human being, which is where Adam tasted the fruit from the forbidden tree, despite God forbidding him to do so, and he did that. And the way Adam basically gives in to temptation, Laura's submission to temptation is something which can be drawn a direct parallel with this particular episode in the Bible. Um, so the goblin in this case can be taken for Satan, who clearly had tempted Adam. So the goblins can be taken for the for the serpent. So you may find the recurring references of fruit in this poem, which probably stands for temptation, which probably stands for experience. Now, Blake happened to be one of the painters that the Pre-Raphaelites looked up to. They turned to, and shifting away or moving away from Raphael and Michelangelo, they tried looking up to a group of painters, as we've established before. So, and Blake's work has been predominantly dealing with the binary of innocence and experience. So before, we can read it like this, that before having the fruit, Laura and Lizzie, what they were living in a state of innocence, and they basically veered their way towards experience once they have more knowledge about the nature of their transgression. So that is a parallel that can be drawn with Blake. So I also have a few line numbers written in your text, line number 9, line number 43 to 45. At some point in line number 406, 407, you will find recurring references to the fruit. Then, of course, there is, you will find references to the flower, which, of course, symbolically represent delicate, fragile purity. You'll find references in line number 83, 120, 150 to 151, even at some point in line number 409. The flower basically represents the delicate, fragile purity, which of course eventually gets lost. We are going to talk about these binaries and how they can be problematic and how they can be problematized eventually. Okay. Money is something which you will find recurring references to. It changes hand twice throughout the course of this poem. So moon again is another symbol which often connects women in poetry. It also may be seen as a symbol of cycle, of changes. Water is something that you will find in the poem itself, which can stand for transparency. So these are the few references that you can, very clearly, if you immediately think of it, come up with while talking about the presence of symbolic meaning in Rossetti's poem. The way she handles detail, the way she, mentions everything down to every little detail. If you can even think about the episode where Laura basically loses the lock of hair, or she trades the lock of hair, which is extremely interesting. It is, she gives meticulous detail to everything. The day, once Laura and Lizzie, they return, and the very next day when Laura is yearning for the fruit again, and Lizzie apparently tells her that, well, it may be a precarious area to be traveling in, but Laura is by now addicted. So that morning, I can immediately think of it right now. Uh, they wake up and there is a detailed description of their household chores where Christina Rossetti says that the two sisters are basically working like bees. So they are engaging in their domestic work, and Christina Rossetti takes the time out and she takes her own time to describe every single detail with precision. And that is just one example. I'm sure you'll find these examples, like the text replete with such examples. They turn to nature as inspiration, of course. This is something that, again, through our discussion of the way Rossetti uses fruit, flower, the moon, the water, it becomes pretty evident. So she, I'm going to really quickly move on to the next slide. This happens to be a very important slide. So when Rossetti was writing, and the year that her years were, she lived from 1830 to 1894. Women, by the time Rossetti died, women did not yet get voting rights. Okay, but there was the movement which was underway. Women's suffrage means voting rights. So suffrage is a right for women to vote in elections. It began in the mid 19th century. Aside from the work being done by women for broad-based economic and political equality and for social reforms, women sought to um, change voting laws to allow them to vote. So this is an extremely important moment in history because, by this time, women have started protesting against the historical injustices that have been meted out to them. Okay. They are basically defying and defiling the system of exploitation, the system itself. There were protests, there were pamphlets doing the rounds, there were petitions that were being signed, and there were a few things that they were asking for. One would be the parliamentary representation. Second would be the voting, the right to vote in elections, because so far, um, they did not even have, let alone voting rights, they did not even have that many vocations open for them. Okay. They would either work as a nanny or a seamstress. The vocational options for them were extremely limited and restricted. And of course, there were a few laws like the law of primogeniture, which basically, denied women the right to even own property. They could not divorce. They could not take custody or claim custody of their own children after divorce or even contest for custodies. And the voting right became an important, moment in history where they started claiming their rights. So in Great Britain, women's suffrage was first advocated by Mary Wollstonecraft in her book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which was written in 1792. The demand for women's suffrage was increasingly taken up by prominent liberal intellectuals in England from the 1950s onwards, notably by John Stuart Mill and his wife Harriet. The first women's suffrage committee was formed in Manchester in 1865, and in 1867, Mill presented to Parliament with this society's petition, which demanded the vote for women, and which contained about 1,550 signatures. So again, this is a very important moment in history for women, and of course, we know that because we know how much that one moment meant for the rights of women. But when this was happening, and Rossetti, of course, was approached for the signature, she refused to include her name in a petition which was in favor of women's suffrage, as Rossetti believed in the biblical subordination of women. So when she was approached, of course, the dichotomy with which she was struggling with, which she was in a way suffering with, was pretty evident. So when she was approached, Rossetti basically said that, well, while I do believe in the rights of women and I do believe in equality, I have my reservations against women in public spheres. I have my reservation against women exposing themselves to different experiences, and women marching in the streets and writing petitions, because biblically and as well as historically, women have been assigned a state of subordination. So in the previous slide, we had seen that, look at the last point, one of the qualities in her poetry would be the steady Anglican piety. So Rossetti was someone who was a devout follower of the Anglican Church and the Anglican piety. And she uh, basically lived her life in a way which wouldn't allow her to even uh, question or problematize the church itself. So that was something that was set in stone for her. And not that she wouldn't struggle in her work for it, she will, and we will see that eventually, but that was something which was extremely important for Rossetti at that point. However, Rossetti was extremely conflicted about a few issues that bothered the contemporary Victorian society, issues like prostitution. Now, prostitution, you have to understand, is something which was a like an extremely pressing issue, and this issue was often cited against one of the reasons why women should not even be given the right. Okay, it was cited like it was in a way used against women, and said that, well, if you get rights or if you have the choice of doing what you do, then look what happens to you, or look what you end up doing, or look how you end up becoming the fallen woman. And I'm sure you've been like told about the idea of fallen woman, which was a concept which prevailed in the contemporary Victorian society. A fallen woman was a woman who the Victorian society would stereotype against, isolate, and they would discriminate against for having lost her chastity before time, for having fallen. It is as though she, very much like Adam, has fallen from the grace of God or something. So I have been told that you have been like introduced to the concept. So I'm not going to get too much into the detail of it, but let's backpedal it a bit and return to this issue of prostitution. Another thing which was plaguing the contemporary society was child prostitution, because in a few extremely important bills, this was mentioned that children ended up becoming the victim of this malpractice, and they, of course, were not agentive people. They did not know what they gave consent to, and there was an increasing number of child prostitutes in the contemporary Victorian society. And when Rossetti was asked to talk about these things or to deal with these things, she was extremely conflicted, because on one hand, she would not sign the petition, which would help contribute her voice to the women's suffrage movement, or towards the movement or the suffragette movement, because a woman who's asking for suffrage or voting right is also called suffragette. Okay, girls? So while she would not sign that petition, she's also extremely plagued by um, you know, the fact that the women were extremely unsafe in the society, where the men were making all the laws, setting all the templates, and she in a way wanted to she, in fact, she in one of her letters that she wrote, she also wrote that if the parliamentary representation of women have even stands a chance to address the issue of prostitution of women, forced prostitution of women, then I would most definitely, I won't mind lending my voice for the cause. So Rossetti is extremely conflicted, and in the next slide we will see the nature of duality in her own work. So her own spiritual understanding of the world, her own spiritual reading of the world, of course, is in direct conflict with the agentive self, right? We discussed this. Because of her spiritual faith and belief, she would not be able to sign a petition that we know by now that it stood for something that changed the lives of women for centuries to come. But she could not take a side on that matter, and yet she is someone who always has advocated for the rights of women. She talked about the agency of women. Her agentive self was always in direct conflict with her uh, belief, okay, her faith and her belief. Another duality, or the other kind of duality that you can see in her work, uh, that you would be able to see if through her representation of the two sisters, okay, Lizzie and Laura, and how differently they experience the fruit. But first, if you talk about the fruit itself, which Laura ends up tasting, and then she ends up getting addicted to it to the extent that her life becomes, her life is in jeopardy. She's decaying, she's uh, ailing, and eventually her sister finds cure for her condition. So look at the how differently the two sisters approach the fruit. When Laura is basically, both of them are walking through the glen. Laura is bowing her head to hear the cry of the goblins, while Lizzie is hiding her face and she's blushing. This happens at the very outset, because you see, the temptation is always present. Look at the first line of your poem. The first line of your poem goes like this: that morning and evening maids hear the goblins cry. So it is something which is prevalent, that it is something which is in continuation. So the women are hearing the goblins offering the fruit morning and evening, but it is as though it falls on the women as to who are the women who are going to listen to or take interest in the cry of the goblins, and who are the ones who are going to walk away from that temptation. Um, Before we even proceed with this, let me clarify that you will find different readings of the concept of fruit. One of the popular readings would be, the fruit would mean, or would go like this, that it symbolizes, or it signifies sexual experience. Okay, so that is a reading that we can go with. There are, of course, other sorts of experiences, and if we return to Blake and his idea of experience altogether, we can also refer to that. I'm not sure if any of you are here who are from West Bengal board, or who have had West Bengal board education, but in West Bengal board you have this poem called Sick Rose. If you, and those of you who haven't, you can read this particular poem. So this poem is something that you can read with Rossetti's work, because this poem is also talks about a rose, which of course symbolizes a woman, an inexperienced woman, who gets corrupted or polluted by experience. A worm apparently enters without consent, or without any prior warning. On a stormy night, a worm basically pollutes or corrupts the rose. A poem which, of course, anybody reading it would not read it as a poem about a literal rose and a literal worm. There is, of course, the same biblical reading of it, that the rose stands for Adam's innocence, and the worm stands for for Satan's temptation, and how Satan pollutes and corrupts Adam would be something that this poem could represent. I'm talking about Sick Rose as well as Goblin Market, by the way. Um, But there is also this other reading, which is that of a woman and her, you know, the woman and her agency, which is represented by the innocent rose, which gets, because even though the woman did agree to the worm or its presence in her life, it did not know what it would mean. But once it has and it goes like, it goes hand in hand with innocence and experience as well, right? When we are innocent, we cannot wait for the experiences, but when we are experienced, and it goes for like literally anything, when we are children, we can't wait to grow up, but now that we are growing up, we are realizing that, well, it may have been a little bit overrated, if I may put it like that. Something like that is happening with the rose, that it has been polluted and corrupted by the worm, and it did not know what it signed up for. It gave in to the temptation, but even while giving in to the temptation, I mean, it could not wait to experience a few things, but while experiencing it, she's realizing that, well, it may have been something that she didn't give consent to, because she did not know what was coming for her, or what exactly she was giving consent to, which again is something which is applicable for Laura, right? Who, even if you read Laura's presence in this poem as the presence of a fallen woman, while having the fruit, Laura does not know what it is going to do to her, what the ramifications of that action, of her actions would be, and what that one moment would bring about in her life. The way she's going to be addicted to the fruit itself, and the way her life is going to be, in a way, dictated and determined by that one moment. So Laura did not know what she gave consent to. And similarly, the symbolic rose in Blake's poem also is unaware as to what awaits it in its life, right? Another, so that is something that I wanted to talk about while talking about the fruit itself, which Laura ends up tasting. Another point of conflict in her work was, again, broadly the Victorian conflict itself, which was science versus religion, because in 1959, Origin of Species, Darwin writes Origin of Species, and which basically piqued the Christian doubt, as to what was written in the book of Genesis about the way the universe was created versus the way the scientists were trying to establish and assert the universe was created. So that conflict was extremely present in Rossetti's work. Um, Another conflict, which I'm sure is something that both of you, like that all of you have, known by now, is the conflict of how to read it, how to read this particular poem. Do we read it as children's literature? Because mind you, Rossetti throughout her life had maintained that her work has to be read as children's literature. Do we read it as children's literature, or do we read it as an adult's erotic fantasy? Because as much as Rossetti would have us believe that this is children's literature, there were clearly, symbolic references. There were clear, uh, you know, she had highlighted a few portions which were extremely, telling of the fact that it isn't quite, while it is extremely befitting to be a children's literature, uh, and different schools, different modules do teach this text as children's literature. When an adult reads it, it becomes something else altogether. We are going to talk about this particular aspect of her work eventually. um, Another duality, this is not even if this is a point of conflict, I think it is intended that she has basically placed the maiden as opposed to the idea of goblin, and she has in a way created this dichotomy, this duality. The maiden, Lizzie and Laura, basically stand for everything that the goblins are not. Now, there are many differences between Lizzie and Laura as well. Like for example, when Laura is walking through the glen, Laura is basically poking Lizzie and asking her to look, whereas Lizzie is telling Laura while walking through the glen that, well, you should not peep at goblin men like that. It's not healthy. It's, a lot can happen out of it. Our lives can be altered irrevocably by doing that. So that is something, the premonition is something that Lizzie plays out in her head, and she even tries to warn her sister, while Laura, of course, is more curious and open to the idea of the experience. Um, which of course leads to her addiction, where she craves the fruit and she says, my mouth waters still. But as is the case with experience, once that happens to you, you lose the charm, right? You no longer find it attractive. You no longer find it, you know, it is never the same. So same thing happens when she gets addicted and she starts saying, my mouth waters still, but she can no longer find the fruits for herself. Even though her sister goes on hearing the cries of the goblin, since she had once given into the temptation, she no longer can find that. Um, the last point would be to resist female subordination versus puritanical conventionality. This is something that we did talk about earlier, that she wanted to resist female subordination. She wanted to lend her voice to issues like prostitution, which were plaguing the contemporary Victorian society. The safety of women were something that, so here is the interesting part. um, while the women were arguing that it is important that we have more women representatives in the parliament in order for these issues to be addressed, the conservative conventional thought, the conservatives were saying that, well, if you are given the freedom, look what you do with it. So they have both the groups have taken up this one issue, but the conservatives, they basically have in a way turned the situation around and victimized women even further by trying to assert the fact that they were the ones who were responsible for their plight, and hence cannot be trusted with the voting rights or any rights for that matter. Um, we are going to sorry, move on to the next slide, which is which basically talks about excuse me, sorry, talks about the heroic sisterhood. So Dorothy Merman makes an observation. She says that fantasy of feminine freedom, heroism, and self-sufficiency, and a celebration of sisterly and maternal love. This is a poem about all the following things, according to Dorothy. So she says it is a dream vision of pre-Raphaelite world from the woman's point of view. Okay. Um, but you know there are problems to this observation as well, and we are going to talk about it eventually. uh, for Christina Georgina Rossetti, the interesting part is that while she is a devout believer, she is a conservative, or a you can call her a partly conservative. She's not entirely a conservative, because she did lend her voice to a few issues, if not all the issues of women. Um, she is someone who celebrates sisterhood. Okay, she is someone who doesn't. While Laura and Lizzie, both of them are sisters, and one of them have transgressed within like quotation, by the way, transgressed as per the contemporary Victorian norms. While one of the sisters has become the fallen woman, the transgressed woman, and the other has somehow, you know, where the other has gone out of her way to procure the experience, and in a way to procure the juice of the fruit, which basically becomes becomes an antidote for her sister. While while she doesn't um, lend her voice to different issues, she is someone who is a believer, and she in a way celebrates sisterhood. She in fact celebrates heroic sisterhood, because which also has something to do with her own experience at this home for fallen women, which is called the Highgate Penitentiary. So in 1860s, she spent a considerable amount of time in one such home, where women where she had seen women living in under destitute conditions, in dastardly situations, deserted, abandoned, ailing from different diseases, and of course, like deserted by all family members. So this particular home, which is called Highgate Penitentiary, it was built for such women, as a shelter for such women, and she basically spent a considerable amount of time in 1860s as a welfare worker in that home. So her experience in that particular home also made her, like also introduced a few conditions, a few situations to her, and she could not shut her eyes to the plight of women in the contemporary society. So she had like she knew what was happening, and she knew that so rather than victimizing these particular women for the choices that they had made, what in her work Rossetti does is she ends up celebrating the heroic sisterhood, or sisterhood itself. So look at the way she represents Lizzie in this text. Although she almost becomes like a folklore heroine who, even though herself did not, give in to temptation, and um, like a protagonist of a parable, had done everything right, quote unquote right, and did not even pay heed to the cry of the goblins, she eventually exposes herself to a situation in order to save her sister. She basically exposes herself the to the glen itself, to the goblins and their world. And but there is an interesting point here, which is that Lizzie does not, like while Laura went into it addle-headed, Laura did not know what to expect or what is to happen to her. Lizzie knew. Lizzie knew exactly what she was signing up for, because she had had the template of her sister, and she went ahead and she put her life at stake anyway. So she apparently is someone who resisted the temptation, and she resisted the temptation in a way that the story of her resistance becomes the reason why her sister gets cured. So talking about um, the heroic sisterhood, where one of them succumbs to temptation and the other one basically resists, we also see like we can also contrast this particular sisterhood to a few other poems of Rossetti. You can read this particular poem. It's called Maudie Clare. While Goblin Market celebrates sisterhood, Rossetti, however, has written poems where women basically have treated one particular man as a point of contention. Okay. For example, in the poem Maudie Clare, what happens is Maudie Clare is a woman who basically was having a courtship with a particular man, and this particular man eventually goes ahead and gets married to somebody called Nell. And by the end of the poem, rather than having a solidarity, rather than having a moment of mutual understanding, Nell stands up to Maudeclair and says that, yeah, though you are taller by the head, more wise, much more fair, I will love him till he loves me best of all, Maudeclair. So basically, this is a woman standing up to another woman and almost antagonizing Maudeclair and trying to assert the fact that she is the one who ended up with the man in question. And interestingly, the man who, over whom both these women are basically debating over, this man, out of shame, has hidden his face. He cannot even face either of the two women. He is not even being able to say the names of both these women in front of each other while introducing them. So this again is a shift away. While there are poems that shift away from the concept of sisterhood, you still have Goblin Market, which in a way stands up for, everything that you need to survive and sustain a world which is extremely antagonistic to you, which is a support network which comes in the form of a sister, a safe space which comes in the form of a sister. So Laura and Lizzie, they taste allurements driven by their sexuality, enter the imaginative and erotic world. They, however, reject the world when they discover that a woman can be strong, bold, clever, Christ-like in active self-sacrifice as well as in endurance. What Lizzie does is she endures the experience with the knowledge that what the ramifications of that experience could be, and she resisted it. So all this while, when the goblins were trying to, in a way, get her to, take active interest in their world and in their lives, making her have the fruit, what Lizzie does is she doesn't eat the fruit. She basically lets them smear the fruit all over her face. And that one particular moment, like since we were discussing the aspects of children's literature, that one particular moment where the goblins basically defile her, many critics have read that one particular moment as, an example of rape or example of a violation of sorts, where a group of men basically, or well, the goblins are not directly compared to men in this particular poem at least, but in the larger society, a woman is being violated by a group. And the reason why she could become the antidote, and we're going to discuss it while opening the next slide, is because she resisted it, and she not even for once gives in to that particular temptation. And the poem ends, by the way, with the celebration of that very sisterhood. This particular line, for there is no friend like a sister, because sisterhood is something that saw both these women through. Even when Lizzie is experiencing all the horrible things that were being done to her, and she was being in a way violated by the goblins, what does she do? She basically thinks about her sister, and how her experience is going to, in a way, or her sister is going to, in a way, benefit from her experience, or she's going to contribute to the life of to the life of her sister, and get the juices of that fruit for her sister. So while for Laura, Lizzie goes out of her way. The sisterhood also sustains Lizzie in her dogged determination to heal her own sister, right? So in the next slide, we're going to talk about desire and the way, it basically reveals itself in this particular poem. So we did set out by discussing this particular fruit, which stands for experience, sexual experience, if you will. And what do the goblins sell? They sell this particular fruit. However, the goblins themselves, they never become the object of desire. Okay, they become the purveyor of, or the seller of this desire, but never the object of desire. Laura doesn't desire the goblin. the goblins, by the way, they are basically agents of desire. The goblins eventually become the agents of desire, but never desire itself. So Laura desires the fruit that the goblins sell, right? And interestingly, there is a degree of murkiness. There is a degree of the detail about where the goblins have gathered their fruit, how they procure it, how they in a way fertilize their land, and how they basically sell it. The entire economy, the chain of production for the goblins, who basically try selling these fruits to women, that has been denied. Okay, that has been obfuscated. Um, at some point, Rossity does mention, however, that they procured the fruit from foreign land or something, but they become the purveyor of desire, and there is no clear indication as to how they even procure the fruit. The market where Laura and Lizzie they work, they basically go to, um, the market becomes the place where this particular desire plays out. Okay, where you want something, and either you can have it or you cannot. If you're a Laura, you're going to want to have it. If you're a Lizzie, you're going to actively resist that temptation. And did discuss the issue of consent, which is extremely important while talking about desire as well. That while Laura did give consent to the cutting of her lock, and she did want to experience, or she was did get tempted to the fruit, I do not. I also would like to argue that in a way she got duped, because she did not know what she was giving consent to or what she was agreeing to. Okay. Another important line is men sell not such in any town. This is a recurring line throughout the text that you will find. Men sell not such in any town. Now, why is that line important? One would be, when you say men sell not such, and some critics have pointed it out, that this is a poem which has entirely done away with any male presence, right? Goblins, we cannot really read them as, because there is a stark contrast when Laura and Lizzie, when the third person's perspective or third person's voice of Rossity says men sell not such in any town. What they do is they basically, um, you know, uh, absolve men of selling such fruit, isolating them as a group of people who have nothing to do with the goblins. This poem, even when Laura and Lizzie get married and they have children, however, there is no mention of the husband or the nature of their relationship that they share with their husbands. Okay, so they have been entirely, men have in a way been entirely absolved in the children's literature, if you read it as a children's literature, that is. um, uh, Talking about desire, another thing uh, which is extremely important and interesting for you to note is the fruit tasted different for two different sisters. For Laura, it was extremely sweet, it was extremely enticing, but for Lizzie, it was bitter. I mean, when Lizzie did not taste the fruit, when Laura tasted it for the second time, when the goblin smeared the fruit all over Lizzie, and when she basically comes to her, when she tastes that, the fruit tasted extremely bitter, and that is the cost of experience. Okay, even but it is also the price of experiences that she pays, or that maybe the sister pays on her behalf, which cures Laura. And a very interesting parallel that you can read, and this particular novella is on Google Books if you can get hold of it. It is called Commonplace. Okay, it's again written by Christina Georgina Rossetti. It is a novella where, again, the protagonist is called Lucy. Um, she learns that the man she loves has married someone else. And the moment she learns that, Lucy ages and fades and withdraws from her family, and she becomes extremely frail, very much like Laura. Okay. But years later, when she meets the man again, and she eventually realizes that she herself has had a certain idea about this man. She has always held this particular man to a certain standard and has always had a template for this man. And the man basically in reality is not who she thought him to be. Most of it is what you can call her imagination of the man. She learns that the man was not worth pining for. And the moment she learns that, she regains her health, and she basically gets cured, and she married a nicer man. So this can be read as an extremely interesting parallel with the particular poem, if you can get hold of the text. Laura, again, is seen as the fallen woman. We did discuss this before. We did take this up before, as opposed to the angel in the house. This is a very interesting term, angel in the house. Angel in the House happens to be a narrative poem written by Coventry Patmore, which is an interesting poem because
ভালো ভালো
Patmore
করছে,
talks
কোনো
about
প্রবলেম
the
হচ্ছে না।
ideal standards of women in his poem. Okay, the ideal woman in his
ঠিক আছে,
head.
ঠিক
This
আছে,
is a
চলবে
poem,
চলবে,
by the way,
হ্যাঁ।
which Patmore writes about his own wife, and he talks about how the wife is an angel in the house, and the responsibility of the wife or the woman would be to stay within the purview of the domestic space, to engage with the household or domestic chores with utmost diligence, while the man should be occupying the public space. So that is something which is extremely interesting for you to remember. Genie, or the concept of the usage of genie, the character, uh, as a warning becomes extremely important, because we cannot really say that she did not know what she was basically giving consent to, because there was always the example of genie, right? So Genie basically is someone who had suffered after tasting the goblin fruit. So and someone who basically paid the an extremely crucial price for having desired, which which is something which I feel is kind of important. This we discussed before, so we are going to really quickly go through this. Goblin Market is a cross-audience poem. It is a it is both the children's fairy tale as well as the adults' erotic fantasy. Mrs. Charles Eliot Norton, who happens to be one of the first reviewers of the poem, wrote that it was a poem which children will con will delight, and which riper minds may ponder over. Um, it can be read as a children's literature, especially because everything resolves itself by the end of the poem, right? Nobody dies, nobody gets hurt, things get sorted. The two sisters live happily ever after, and it downplays the perils of the real world, because in reality, if we read it as an adult poem, we know that people who transgress, what happens? They basically end up in the Highgate Penitentiary, like places like the Highgate Penitentiary, where Christina Rossetti was working as a you know working as a welfare worker. Um, I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to try to rush this. Um, these are the three images that I could get hold of three different productions of the uh, poem, which is, the Playboy magazine, which is notoriously known for its representation or lack thereof of women. So Playboy has reproduced it, like has in a way taken an excerpt from this particular poem in this particular image. If you can see, I know it's a bit grainy, and they basically quoted the lines "Eat me, drink me, love me," while a direct excerpt from like the poem itself. This, however, is a publication of a children's book. If you read it as just as children's literature, this was published by, I think, Signet, um, or Penguin. Yes, Penguin USA. So this was their blurb. Um, the third poster is kind of interesting, because this is a theater. theater production of Goblin Market. And this one, if you can see, is basically an adaptation of Goblin Market for adults. And it is also an erotic fantasy, which has been mentioned in the subtitle. And it does highlight the queer angle shared between Laura and Lizzie. And in a way, stresses over it. Um, I also wanted to talk about the idea of the market, or the way you understand it. Market is a place where you will first of all see the economic language, which is buying, selling, offering, stock, money, gold, which are employed by Rossity in this particular poem. So the market is not only a place for potential danger, but it is also a place for pleasure, as you've seen with the experience of Laura. Uh, Maybe like it is a place, it is the danger is the price that Laura pays for the pleasure. So the goblins here are both economic and sexual creatures, suggestive of an intersection between the economic and sexual systems. We did talk about the issue of prostitution plaguing the contemporary Victorian society, if you remember. So the sisters have an independent economic system at home. We did talk about it briefly before, where they work like bees, produce their own labor, food which sustains them. The home that usually becomes a place for exploitation for women becomes their safe space, and the market is the place of desire, a place to splurge for them. And it is also a place for attraction, because Laura, who doesn't have money, her attraction to the world of exchange comes hand in hand with her powerlessness within it. And this powerlessness, by the way, is extremely gendered in a world which does not allow you rights. Her body, of course, becomes something to value in the gendered system of exchange, which signifies the cutting of the lock, and which also can be, if you read it along with Pope's The Rape of the Lock, you will see that how giving away a lock can actually signify an act of violation. Um, in my last slide, I wanted us together, and these are the questions that I wouldn't be able to have. These are the questions that occurred to me. So I wanted to, in a way, share them with you. So it goes like this. There are four questions that I would like to leave you with. One would be, since there is no male presence in the world of this poem, does the world depicted in the poem become a safe, habitable space for women? If and do you think that this poem works as a warning issued for women? If women are the true victims of sexual and economic exploitation, then should they even be at the receiving end of the moral policing and disciplining? Because if the purpose of this poem is to warn women against the perils of life, then should they even be at the receiving end of this? Huh. And the last question that I have is, rather than discussing the ways to change the market itself, does this poem talk about changing the way in which women conduct themselves? So with these four, I know we are basically running out of time, so I would like to wrap up here. And if you have any questions, you can, of course, ask.
So thank you so much, Sritama, for sharing so many valuable perspectives.
Thank
It
you,
was
Ritik.
really well designed, I must say, your entire talk. And students, if you have any questions, please go ahead with it. We are actually running out of time. So if you have any questions, please be quick.
I'm so sorry
That's
I,
all right.
I did drag the presentation for too long.
I'm sure our
I didn't
I'm
see
sure
it
our
through.
students enjoyed it.
Yeah.
So girls, any questions? Okay, I guess not. So, as we end our second session today, on behalf of the entire English department of Rani Birla Girls College, I thank Sritama for finding time to prepare and deliver such a detailed lecture and discuss such valuable points which were relevant during the Victorian era, and some of these continue to be perils today. Like mansplaining hasn't stopped, right? Of course,
Yeah.
as you rightly pointed out. So, thank you so much, Sritama. And with this, we come to an end of our second session today, and we'll return at 3 p.m. to listen to today's final lecture by Devjyoti Sarkar, who will speak about where modernity lies in modern theatre. So see you all then.
Thank you.